Welcome back. So now it's time for lesson number 2. And as you can see here, this lesson is called HCI mesh operations. This is the lesson that shows you how to mount a remote vSAN data store. It shows you what you expect to see as you look at the vSphere client. So let's start. Now remember, I have 2 clusters, and on purpose, and I'm going to show you this, my 2 clusters are a little bit different. One has 5 nodes, one has 3. I want you to remember that. Now, if you take a look, here we see the goals for lesson number 2. So let's go through them. Number 1, I'm going to show you how to mount a remote vSAN data store. That's very easy. It's not really rocket science. You'll be able to do that in no time whatsoever in the vSphere client. Number 2, we're going to explain exactly what you see from the server side and from the client side. Next, it says we will explain cluster health with VM creation test. Remember, you can run a proactive test. This time around, you could run a VM creation proactive test, and you can choose your local data store or the remote data store. And then lastly, notice it says we will describe the remote object placement on the GUI. So once again, it should be very easy to make sure that you can see that your objects now reside on a remote vSAN data store. And if you take a look, remember this is a brand new feature in 7.0 Update 1. So when you take a look at this page is called Introducing HCI Mesh Operations. Remember, here they're telling you that if you want, you can mount somebody else's vSAN data store. There are certain gotchas. Remember, both clusters need to be in the same data center. They need to be controlled by the same vCenter server. And you can see that's what they tell you here. Also, this is not for 2-node clusters or stretch clusters. So this is for regular vSAN clusters. Now let's take a look. What exactly are we showing you here? Now imagine I log into the vSphere client. And let's say I am on my first cluster. But there's a second cluster. So I want to mount the vSAN data store belonging to that second cluster. So what do? What I do is I go and I select my cluster. I go to the Configure tab. And in this section for vSAN, as you can see here, you find the option Data Store Sharing. So all you have to do is click on Mount Remote Data Store. Now if you take a look, here you can see in parentheses that the GUI is telling you which one is your vSAN data store. So in this case, you can see I'm working with a cluster called SA Cluster 01. Now, as you can see here, his data store is called vSAN Data Store Cluster 1. So that is your local data store, but you want to mount somebody else's. So when you click on Mount Remote Data Store, you better believe you're going to be able to see the one belonging to the other cluster. And if you take a look, that's what we show you here. So all you have to do is simply select that particular data store. Now, when you click on Next, the system will show you whether or not this will work. And you can see, again, you have a whole section for what needs to be compatible or not. Now, let's take a look at some of these without reading every single one of them. Now, the first one is a check that tells you that the remote data store indeed is a vSAN data store. I've never seen that fail. Notice it says the select the server cluster is remote. Cluster configuration is supported. That's an interesting one. I'm going to show you 2 instances where I successfully mount the vSAN data store and another instance where I cannot. For example, the first time around, if both clusters pretty much look the same, you better believe that's going to work. But in my second demo, what I'm going to do is I am going to try to mount the vSAN data store belonging to another cluster. But this time, I'm going to have on the second cluster, data in transit encryption enabled. And you will notice that that will make it fail. So again, we talked about that briefly when we were talking about security. Now notice, here you can see images where it says, all right, SA vSAN 01 is mounting no more than 5 remote vSAN data stores. So remember, I can mount yours, you can mount mine, but again, there's a limit on how many I can mount. So when you take a look, right, By the time you're done, you're going to see two data stores, just like I show you here. You can see one of them says local. Obviously, the other one is the remote one, the one that doesn't really belong to you. Now, you can see here all sorts of information. So, for example, if you look at the upper left, you can see that I am working with SA cluster 01. So when you look at the data stores, notice the first one, in parentheses, it says local. So you know that's yours. But if you look at the second one, it doesn't say local or remote. But if you go towards the right, you can see you are the client cluster. Because again, notice your name is there, SA cluster 01. And when you take a look, here is where the other cluster will show you. So in this case, I'm looking at cluster 02. Cluster 02 says, I have my own local data store. I haven't mounted somebody else's data store, but I do have currently a cluster that happens to be my client. So when you look towards the right from cluster 2, you can see that cluster 1 is your client. Now, when you look at this capture here, notice what they're doing. They're selecting a data store. They're choosing hosts, and this shows you all the hosts that can access this data store, the ones for the local cluster and the ones belonging to the other one. Notice, in this case, we have the data store for the second cluster, yet you can see that we have X number of servers belonging to a cluster called SA vSAN01 and X number of servers belonging to SB vSAN01. Now, what they tell you here is that if you want, you can very easily run a proactive test. We've talked about this test before, but in this case, I want to run this proactive test. I want to create temporarily VMs, but I want to test the creation of the VMs on that remote data store. So you can choose that. And you better believe you're expecting a positive result. As you can see here, they have run the test. It says passed. And once again, you can see exactly the results. Now, if you take a look at this, here we're talking about Skyline Health. Remember, this is your best friend for troubleshooting. So if we introduce new features, you better believe that we're going to have a new section of that feature in Skyline Health. And as you can see here, notice you can see information about your local objects and also remote accessible objects. In this case, everything looks good. And this is what you want to see. So when you take a look, another thing that you can do is see whether or not you have a partition. Remember, if I have 4 servers and you have 4 servers, all 8 of us need to be able to communicate with each other to be able to access the same vSAN data store. So this is a way to once again troubleshoot your environment potentially, assuming that you have some kind of network issue, which results in a network partition. And when you look at this page, what do we see here? As you can see here, we're showing you performance-related charts. Remember, this goes back to the performance service. This time around, if you notice, we have a new section. And again, that section is for remote VMs. So you can see the type of performance that you're having when you have a VM running, for example, in cluster 1, yet the objects reside on cluster 2. And when you take a look, if you look at the physical displacement, the way that you can very easily tell that your VM resides on a remote vSAN data store is by looking, and obviously if you can read that it says remote accessible, once again that is telling you that that VM again is running in one cluster, yet all the objects happen to reside on a second cluster. Now remember, in a second, I'm going to do a quick demo. And when I do that demo, I'm going to show you this succeeding. But then again, I'm going to do a second demo. And I am going to show you in the second demo this failing. All right. I'll see you when we do the demo. Enjoy.